Vernon felt the weight of collapse long before the truth was revealed, but he refused to acknowledge it until the moment Leslie tore open the last layer of the life he had built. For years, he had learned the art of control, controlling his public image, controlling his family's narrative, controlling every detail that threatened to drift out of alignment. Yet control had always been a fragile illusion, stretched thin by the secrets he kept hidden behind a facade of strength. When Leslie dismantled that illusion with a single revelation, a sense of raw exposure struck him with the force of a storm he could no longer contain. Sharon sensed the fracture the moment it happened. She had lived in the shadow of Vernon's decisions, often complicit, sometimes unwilling, but always aware that the stability of the Dupree family teetered on the edge of truths too dangerous to surface. She felt a familiar dread rising inside her, a dread born from years of watching Vernon sacrifice morality for reputation. Sharon understood that the truth Leslie carried had the power to unravel everything: his legacy, their marriage, the carefully polished image of the Dupree family. The air in the house felt charged with a kind of electric panic, as though the walls themselves knew that something irreversible had begun. Leslie had expected anger, maybe denial, but she had not anticipated how deeply her revelation struck Vernon. She believed the truth should be known, believing that exposing secrets was the only way to break the cycle of deceit that had consumed the Duprees. But she underestimated the desperation of a man who believed the world owed him the right to remain unchallenged. Leslie carried no malice, she carried a determination to disrupt the power structure that had harmed too many. Yet the more she sensed Vernon's panic, the more she realized she had ignited a fire she could not control. Her resolve remained, but her certainty began to shake under the intensity of Vernon's unraveling. Vernon's internal descent began with a quiet, cold tension, the kind that coils beneath the skin like a venom that has yet to strike. Shame blended with fury, forming a volatile mix that clouded his reasoning. He replayed Leslie's revelation repeatedly, each recollection sharpening his rage. The world he had shaped felt suddenly flimsy, susceptible to collapse under the pressure of her truth. He had always believed he could manipulate outcomes, bend circumstances, and reshape narratives, but Leslie's knowledge existed beyond his control. That knowledge was a threat, and in Vernon's mind, threats required elimination. Sharon watched the shifts in him with increasing terror. She saw the tightening of his jaw, the rigid movements, the quiet pacing, the silence that felt more dangerous than shouting. She tried to measure his emotional instability, searching for a point of intervention, but found none. Her fear deepened when she realized he was not just angry, he was terrified. And Vernon in fear was far more dangerous than Vernon in rage. His fear translated into an obsessive need to restore order, even if restoring it demanded extreme measures. Leslie became aware of Vernon's escalating volatility when she noticed the sudden change in his presence. The polite distance he once maintained vanished, replaced by a haunting tension that followed her like a shadow. She felt the pressure of unseen eyes, sensed the shift in tone within the household, and understood she was now an adversary in Vernon's mind. She attempted to maintain caution while continuing her pursuit of the truth, but each passing hour made clear that Vernon's patience had shattered. Still, she held on to the belief that truth, once spoken, could not be undone. But Vernon did not share her belief. To him, truth was something to be controlled, molded, concealed, or eradicated. And as the urgency of the situation intensified, he reached a point where logic gave way to instinct. Instinct told him that Leslie's presence was an existential threat, a danger not only to him but to everything he represented. He viewed her not as a person but as a catalyst for ruin. That dehumanization made the next step feel almost inevitable. The night Vernon acted was shrouded in a deceptive stillness. He watched Leslie leave the property, observed her vulnerability in the darkness, and allowed his instincts to override the last remnants of rationality. His pulse throbbed with the anticipation of reclaiming control. The plan formed not from strategy but from desperation, manifesting as a single cruel conclusion: the only way to stop the collapse was to remove its cause. Sharon realized something was terribly wrong when she noticed Vernon's absence and the eerie quiet that settled in the house. The dread she had carried all day crystallized into full-blown panic when she pieced together the clues he had unknowingly left behind. She traced his movements, identified the shift in his demeanor, and recognized the pattern of a man preparing to do something irreversible. Sharon's guilt intertwined with her fear. She knew she had enabled him for too long, dismissing warnings, excusing behavior, and supporting his need for dominance. Now she stood on the brink of consequences she had helped cultivate. Leslie felt the presence behind her before she could fully understand what was happening. Her instincts screamed danger, but the realization came too late. Vernon moved with the determination of a man driven by the terror of losing everything. The act unfolded with chilling precision, shaped by fear and fueled by fury. Leslie's struggle was suffocated by the weight of Vernon's desperation, and within minutes, she found herself pulled into a nightmare she had never imagined. He transported her to a secluded location, chosen not for practicality but for isolation. Somewhere no one would hear, no one would intervene, and no one would uncover his act until he decided otherwise. The space mirrored Vernon's psyche, cold, controlled, stripped of humanity. Leslie was placed in an environment where her vulnerability contrasted sharply with the intensity of his unraveling. The darkness around them became a physical manifestation of Vernon's internal collapse. Bound and unable to escape, Leslie faced the horrifying reality of Vernon's transformation. She tried to understand the depth of his fear, piecing together the emotional fractures that led him here. Vernon paced the room like a man hunted by his own conscience, torn between the need to silence her and the remnants of a morality he once possessed. His breathing was uneven, his eyes unfocused, his movements erratic. Leslie saw not a villain but a man consumed by the ghosts of his own choices. Vernon's internal battle reached its peak in that confined space. He oscillated between trembling guilt and ruthless determination. One moment, he imagined the consequences, the destruction of his family, the loss of everything he held dear. The next moment, he saw Leslie as the embodiment of betrayal, a threat that needed to be neutralized. His mind twisted the narrative until he believed he had no choice, convincing himself that survival required sacrifice. The conflict played out violently within him, each moment adding to the erosion of his sanity. Sharon arrived at the truth slowly and painfully. She followed Vernon's trail, each step guided by intuition and fear. When she realized he had taken Leslie, her breath caught painfully in her chest. She imagined the worst, knowing Vernon would never voluntarily relinquish control once he crossed a line. She felt responsible, not for Leslie's revelation, but for allowing Vernon to cultivate a world where desperation overshadowed morality. Sharon was forced to confront her own complicity, recognizing that silence and support had enabled this horrific transformation. The guilt that consumed Sharon became a force that propelled her forward. She searched through the places Vernon frequented, revisiting memories she had tried to bury, recalling conversations that now took on new meaning. Every moment was filled with the dread that she would arrive too late. Her mind replayed the escalation, tracing every sign she ignored, every moment she justified Vernon's actions, every argument she brushed aside. She knew that saving Leslie meant confronting the darkest parts of her husband, and herself. Vernon's turmoil deepened as Leslie remained captive. He struggled to maintain the narrative he told himself, but her presence made it impossible to escape the reality of what he had done. The room felt smaller with each passing moment, suffocating him in a mixture of regret and fury. He felt trapped between the man he had pretended to be and the man he had become. Each time he glanced at Leslie, he saw both the threat and the consequence of his choices. Leslie, though terrified, refused to surrender to despair. She watched Vernon carefully, analyzing his emotional fractures, searching for any sign that reason might return. She recognized that his actions stemmed not purely from cruelty but from a lifetime of pressure, expectation, and fear. She understood that he was not simply lashing out, but spiraling under the crushing weight of a truth he could not face. Her resilience became her anchor, allowing her to hold on to a fragile hope that his conscience might re-emerge before it was too late. Sharon's arrival at the location Vernon had chosen marked the beginning of a silent confrontation. She stepped into the freezing darkness of his desperation, her breath trembling as she took in the scene before her. Her world fractured in a way she had never experienced, forcing her to reckon with the undeniable truth of what Vernon had become. She saw not a husband but a man who had lost control of everything that once held him together. The sight of Sharon struck Vernon with a force stronger than Leslie's revelation. For the first time, he saw himself reflected in her expression. Fear, disappointment, and a sorrow so deep it cut through the anger clouding his mind. Sharon's presence threatened the fragile narrative he clung to, exposing the horror of his actions. His internal walls crumbled, leaving him stripped of the false certainty that had driven him to this moment. Leslie watched the couple from her restrained position, witnessing the collapse of a man who had once held the power to intimidate her. Vernon stood frozen between two women who represented the consequences of his choices, one who revealed his truth, and one who tried to protect him from it. Sharon's trembling presence cast a stark emotional light over the night, revealing the cost of silence, complicity, and ambition. In that suffocating room, Vernon's emotions collided, fear, rage, shame, grief, until the force of them threatened to shatter him completely. His breath grew shallow, his hands trembled, and his body swayed as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear. His mind tried to cling to excuses, justifications, and distortions, but each attempt dissolved under the pressure of reality. He realized that he had not acted out of protection but out of cowardice. The truth he feared was not the truth Leslie carried, but the truth of who he had become. Sharon stepped closer to him, her heart pounding with the knowledge that this moment would define the rest of their lives. She felt the fracture in her identity, the split between the woman who once supported him and the woman who now had to confront him. Vernon's collapse mirrored the collapse of their marriage, the collapse of the image they had worked so hard to maintain, the collapse of everything she had blindly defended. In the heavy silence that filled the room, Vernon faced the consequences of his fear. Leslie's strength and Sharon's sorrow forced him to confront the truth he had tried to bury. His transformation, the shift from a powerful patriarch to a desperate, broken man, became tragically complete. He understood that the life he fought to protect was already lost, destroyed not by Leslie but by his own inability to face the truth. Sharon moved slowly toward Leslie, her hands shaking as she worked to free her. The act symbolized a decisive break from the past, a rejection of the role she once played, a decision to choose integrity over loyalty. Leslie's release marked the beginning of the end of Vernon's tightly controlled world. Vernon sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the collapse of his own making. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him until he could no longer bear the burden. The room felt impossibly small, filled with the consequences of a lifetime of denial. He felt the crushing realization that everything he had feared losing had been destroyed by the very actions he believed would protect it. Leslie stood beside Sharon, shaken but grounded, her resolve stronger than before. Sharon felt the first stirrings of liberation, mixed with grief for the man Vernon once was. Vernon remained frozen in his devastation, the shadows of his choices falling heavily around him. And in that small, dim room, the truth finally overtook the lies, consuming the last remnants of a legacy built on fear, secrecy, and control. The night left none of them unchanged. Vernon had fallen into the abyss he created. Sharon had broken free from the path that led her there. Leslie had survived the darkness meant to silence her. The storm of secrets, anger, and betrayal that had consumed them reached its agonizing end, leaving behind only the raw truth that no one could escape.